On February 16, 2024, a Manhattan courtroom fell silent. Judge Arthur Engoron, sitting in New York Supreme Court, delivered a controversial sentence: $364 million. Not a fine, not a penalty, a judgment. A declaration that the man who built his brand on the words Trump and success had systematically lied. The number climbed higher as interest accrued daily. By the time appeals mounted months later, the total reached over $500 million, enough to own entire city blocks, enough to purchase hundreds of luxury properties, enough to permanently alter the balance sheet of America's most recognizable real estate brand. This was about provable fraud, documented, quantifiable, undeniable. The man who famously claimed his net worth exceeded $10 billion had inflated his assets by somewhere between $812 million and $2.2 billion. The judge called it repeated and persistent fraud, but Trump called it a fraud on me. Two realities, same man, same assets, same lies. How a billionaire becomes a liar. To understand how this happened, you need to understand the Trump Organization's fundamental business model. It wasn't really about construction. It wasn't about building better. It was about perception. Making people believe that Trump properties were worth more than they actually were. Making bankers believe. Making insurance companies believe. Making the public believe. For decades, this strategy worked perfectly. Trump would acquire property, inflate its value in financial statements, show those inflated values to banks, secure massive loans at favorable rates, and pocket the difference. It's not complicated, it's just systematic. But in 2021, New York Attorney General Letitia James decided to investigate. What she uncovered wasn't random exaggeration. It was huge fraud. Carefully designed, specifically executed, and repeated across decades. The evidence: thousands of documents, testimony from Trump's own employees, financial records that told a story of deliberate deception. Triplex that never existed. Let's start with the crown jewel, the Trump Tower penthouse. The address is simple: 725 Fifth Avenue, New York City. The property is a 3-story penthouse that sits atop one of Manhattan's most iconic buildings, Trump's primary residence, his personal sanctuary, his proof of success. In financial statements submitted to banks and insurance companies, Trump claimed this penthouse was 11,000 square feet. Actual measurements: 6,514 square feet. He was off by 69%. He made it bigger in his mind and on his paperwork, but not in reality. More damaging is, of course, the valuation. Trump valued his own apartment at $327 million. This matters because no residential apartment in New York City, not one, has ever sold for anywhere close to that amount. The highest priced residential sale in Manhattan's history? $238 million. Trump's claim was roughly $89 million higher than the record. When Judge Engoron reviewed comparable sales, he determined the penthouse was worth closer to $61 million, roughly 1/5 of Trump's claimed value. That's not a valuation difference, that's a fantasy. But Trump needed bankers to believe it, so they got financial statements with the inflated number, and banks extended credit based on fraudulent documentation of collateral. $500 million Florida fantasy. Now shift south to Palm Beach, Florida, Mar-a-Lago, the private club that would eventually become Trump's primary residence after leaving office. The 128-acre estate that defined Trump's lifestyle. In his financial statements, Trump valued Mar-a-Lago at between $426 million and $612 million. Sometimes he claimed it was worth $500 million, sometimes higher. The number shifted depending on which document you were reading and who he was trying to convince. The Palm Beach County Property Appraiser, the official government body responsible for determining property values, assessed Mar-a-Lago at between $18 million and $27.6 million. Across the years Trump was making his inflated claims. Judge Engoron ruled Trump had overvalued Mar-a-Lago by at least 2,300%. Think about that number. Not 20%, not 200%, 2,300%. The difference between a mansion and a small apartment was the actual discrepancy. What made this particularly damaging in court? Trump's own tax representative testified that he had advised valuing the property much lower than what appeared in Trump's financial statements. Even the people working for Trump knew the numbers were fabricated. The irony cuts deeper when you consider that Trump himself paid $10 million for Mar-a-Lago back in 1985. Adjusting for inflation and improvements over 35 years, the increases should have been modest. Instead, Trump claimed it had appreciated 4,000% beyond the actual market rate. 40 Wall Street story. Move to Manhattan again. 40 Wall Street, a historic Art Deco skyscraper that Trump acquired in the 1990s. It's an impressive building, genuinely significant architecture. In Trump's financial statements, he valued this property at approximately $500 million. The New York tax assessor valued it at roughly $160 million. That $340 million difference? It wasn't based on Trump's superior knowledge of the market. It was based on one fundamental principle. Trump needed the number to be big. A banker reviewing Trump's financial statements in 2012 would have seen a portfolio worth billions. That banker would have assumed Trump was genuinely wealthy. That banker would have approved loans that wouldn't have been approved if the actual lower valuations were disclosed. This is how the fraud functioned. Not through a single deceptive transaction, but through a pattern of deceptive transactions. Multiple properties, multiple overvaluations, multiple financial institutions deceived. When prosecutors added them all up, Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago, 40 Wall Street, Trump Park Avenue, golf club properties, the total overvaluation ranged from $812 million to $2.2 billion. Judge Engoron concluded the precise number didn't matter. The pattern was undeniable. Who actually paid for Trump's lies? This is the part of the story most people miss. When you fraudulently value your property to secure a loan, you're not just lying to a bank, you're creating systemic risk. Banks that extended credit to Trump on the basis of fraudulent valuations couldn't recoup losses if Trump defaulted. Insurance companies that insured Trump properties on the basis of fraudulent valuations faced exposure they didn't expect. But more broadly, investors in those banks and insurance companies absorbed the risk. Employees at those institutions who'd invested their retirement savings faced uncertainty. Trump's fraud wasn't a victimless white-collar crime. It was a systematic deception that shifted risk from Trump himself onto financial institutions and, ultimately, onto the general public that relies on those institutions. Trial that changed everything. The trial that preceded the judgment lasted months. Trump himself testified for 6 minutes, declaring he was an innocent man and that the case was a fraud on me. What he didn't do was provide documentation showing his valuations were accurate. He didn't produce expert witnesses proving Mar-a-Lago was worth $500 million. He didn't explain why his accountants valued properties so differently from the actual assessments. Instead, the prosecution presented thousands of documents. They presented Trump's own employees, including some who'd worked directly on financial statements. They presented comparative analysis showing what comparable properties actually sold for. When testimony ended, the evidence wasn't ambiguous. Judge Engoron had essentially pre-ruled on the central question back in 2023 when he issued a summary judgment finding that Trump had indeed engaged in fraud. The trial that followed was about determining damages and penalties. Trump and his sons Eric and Don Jr., along with the Trump Organization itself, had committed fraud. The financial penalty would exceed $350 million before interest accrual. Real cost of business. Trump and his adult sons were barred from managing or directing companies in New York for 3 years. Trump couldn't serve as an officer or director of any New York-based business during that period. The real estate empire Trump had spent 5 decades constructing suddenly had an expiration date on his direct involvement. More immediately, Trump faced a bonding requirement. To appeal the judgment, he'd need to post an appeal bond, essentially a financial guarantee that if he lost the appeal, he could pay. Trump asked to post a $100 million bond rather than the full $464 million. The court rejected it. This created a bind: post the full bond or abandon the appeal. For a man who claimed a net worth exceeding $10 billion, the inability to post a $464 million bond exposed an uncomfortable truth about Trump's actual liquid assets versus his claimed net worth. By August 2025, the appellate court ruled the penalty violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against excessive fines. The judgment was voided, but this didn't mean Trump had won. It meant a new trial or settlement would determine the final number, only that the specific amount violated constitutional limits. Reckoning nobody saw coming. Now, we know Trump built an entire personal brand on the premise of being the world's greatest dealmaker. The guy who always wins, the businessman who sees opportunities others miss. The brand was built on perceived wealth. The Trump Tower penthouse mattered not because Trump actually lived there most of the time, but because it represented success. The image of opulence mattered more than the reality. But once you're forced to defend that image in court, under oath, with expert witnesses and comparable property analysis and tax records, the fiction collapses. Trump claimed his net worth was above $10 billion. The court determined that tens of thousands of documents over multiple decades showed systematic inflation of assets. The difference between his claims and the actual values wasn't modest overestimation. It was huge deception. What happens when the brand itself is built on falsified financial statements? Empire after the judgment. The Trump Organization continues operating. Trump Tower still stands. Mar-a-Lago still functions as a private club. The golf courses still exist. Trump himself returned to political office in January 2025, suggesting the civil fraud judgment wouldn't prevent him from pursuing political power, despite preventing him from managing businesses in New York. But the fundamental vulnerability of the Trump brand was exposed. Banks will never trust his valuations again. Insurance companies will demand independent appraisals. Future lenders will assume deception. The billionaire who spent 50 years selling himself on his business genius discovered that reputation, once destroyed by facts, never fully recovers. What's your honest take? Does wealth guarantee accountability, or does it only delay it? Drop your thoughts below, and if you want to see more of the world's richest icons and luxury stories, subscribe right now, because this is where the legends live forever.